So you mentioned democracy. Is the Democratic Republic that is the United States of America, is it compatible? Can it coexist with Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism, again, we're talking a whole spectrum of commitments. So for some people who say, kind of God and country America, Christian patriotism, and yeah, they're going to respect election results, and they're going to understand that they're going to lose sometimes and that they're going to have to compromise, right? It's then that kind of Christian nationalism, like the very kind of milder end of the spectrum. Sure, it's totally compatible with democracy. But when you start saying that Christians have a special role to play and that the government must kind of reflect Christian values, and this is where we get into this language of, is this a democracy or is this a republic? And you've heard this in conversations around our new Speaker of the House. And this has been common in conservative Christian spaces for decades now. Actually, it can be traced back to the John Birch Society. But essentially, the way this question goes is the claim that we are not a democracy. We are a republic. And by which they mean a Christian republic, because this is linked to the idea that America was founded as a distinctly Christian nation. Even some will go so far as to say our founding documents were inspired directly by God. So if they're inspired by God, and if we're founded as a specifically, distinctively Christian nation, then that Constitution must reflect and can only protect God's values, God's laws. So you can kind of see where this is going. So constitutional rights cannot be interpreted in ways that go against God's law, in ways, for example, that support LGBTQ rights. That's just a contradiction. And that's where we start moving into the area of being incompatible with democracy. If you say this is a Christian republic, and if you have that particular understanding of God's kind of inspiration, and our founding documents must reflect that, that is not compatible with a pluralistic understanding of American democracy.
So and we'll talk about the new speaker, MAGA Mike Johnson, on his views on LGBTQ, but let's focus on one other thing here. He was, the New York Times called him the architect of Donald Trump's electoral scheme, the one in trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the election results. And so there's a political angle there, but I wonder, from your point of view and your experience, could there also be a religious angle? The idea that it doesn't matter what the people say, we have to keep Donald Trump in power because he's appointed Supreme Court justices that are going to overturn Roe v. Wade. I don't care. He's just a vessel for us, but he is the vessel that's going to get us to the promised land of a nation based on the Bible. Is that potentially part of the motivation for what Mike Johnson tried to overturn the election?
I think we have to consider that as part of what's happening here. So if we think of Christian nationalism, it really it depends on this understanding of us versus them, right? There's a division between real Americans, true Americans who are carrying on its kind of God-given destiny, the nation's destiny, versus all of the rest, right? And if you're not with us, you're against us. You are then kind of on the side of the devil. And you'll get language in some of these spaces about Democrats being on the side of the devil, they're demonic and so on, and I get that thrown at me as well in some of these spaces. So this very stark division of you're with us or you're against us. And yes, along with that then comes this ends justifying the means mentality. If God is on your side, anything you do is righteous, right? And anybody who is against you is against God. And so you end up justifying all sorts of things. And this was really some of the thinking behind the strong and persistent conservative evangelical support for Trump. Everybody knew he didn't model kind of particular biblical virtues, but precisely because of that, he seemed the best man for the job, God's anointed, because he said he would fight to protect Christianity, to protect God, and he was going to be ruthless when he did that, and that was perfect.
Oh boy. With Kisten Du Mez, historian and author of the book Jesus and John Wayne and more in our Substack. So, Rick Santorum was on last night. I think it was on Newsmax, and he was on a right-wing show, and they talked about the Ohio ballot initiative, which the people, about almost 60% of Ohio voters voted to make the access to abortion as well as birth control a constitutional right. And Rick Santorum said this show, went to some political analysis, but then he got to the real heart of it. And he goes, that's why pure democracies are not the way to run a country. And Rick Santorum is a very far right guy. Rick Santorum who's literally said our law should comport with the Bible and with higher law. That to me is the essence of this right-wing Christian nationalism. Maybe it's right-wing Christian nationalism is the way we describe it. But in any event, so when you hear Rick Santorum say pure democracy is not a way to run a country, knowing who he is, what does that say to you?
Yeah. So here again, you can kind of interpret it in different ways. He could have been talking strictly about the referendum process and that sort of direct democracy, which is could be seen as inefficient in different ways, right? So there's a kind of more innocent context that you could analyze those claims in, but then you also have this kind of general hostility towards democracy, and there's a reason for this, right? Because over the last decade or so, we've really started to confront a demographic change in this country, what Robert Jones has referred to as the end of white Christian America, right? And so over the last decade or so, conservative white evangelicals are seeing these numbers and realizing that their old tactics of incredibly effective political mobilization might not cut it anymore, right? They don't have numbers on their side. And so what you're seeing is a general erosion in their commitment to democracy. And again, this ends justifying the means mentality when you don't have numbers on your side and when you feel besieged and there's a strong sense of persecution complex and embattlement inside evangelical spaces. And that doesn't happen by accident. That is intentionally cultivated by leaders because it's a really great tool for political mobilization and for fundraising, right? And so they instill this fear of they're out to get you. And then there's actual changes that are happening too. In addition to demographic changes, we've had dramatic cultural changes around the issue of gay rights in just the last 15 years or so. And so conservative evangelicals, given their framework, kind of fear and embattlement, seeing the demographics and feeling like their views are no longer kind of at the center of American culture, but are now increasingly marginalized, right? All of these things kind of come together and create a sense of urgency, even desperation and radicalization.
So, last night, the big results, the headline for most people was that reproductive rights and freedoms drove the election. We had, obviously, Ohio was right on the nose because that was a ballot initiative. Also had in Virginia, that was hanging over the state legislative races. And the Democrats not only held the Senate, they took back the House of Delegates, much to Republican Glenn Youngkin's chagrin. Even in Kentucky, where it was an incumbent running for re-election, but he did make an issue. And there was a very famous ad he played during the campaign. Now it's famous, of a young woman who had been raped when she was younger, saying Daniel Cameron, the Republican, would have forced me to carry the rapist. And it was a rapist who was a family member. So it was incest and rape. So when we see this now, first of all, what does that say to you before we get the reaction of what the right's going to say?
Yeah. I think that we talk a lot about our polarized political moment and increasing polarization, and that is absolutely true, right? We feel that. Any of us who are out in these spaces feel that every day.
Sure.
On the other hand, when you look at survey data, what you see over and over again is the majority of Americans are somewhere in the middle. Right. But our politics doesn't reflect that. And our politics isn't designed to reflect that, both kind of ideologically and rhetorically. But also, if you look at the effects of gerrymandering in many of these races and the primaries and so on, it kind of pulls our candidates to the edges where many Americans are still somewhere in the middle. And that's very much the case on an issue like abortion. But on the right, they have been moving more extreme, not just with their victory in the Dobbs case, but in terms of now pursuing that across the nation, state by state level. But what you're also hearing in these conservative spaces is the rise of abolitionism. And so a much harsher approach. By that, they mean the absolute abolition of any and all abortion. So no exceptions ever. Right. Mm-hmm. And harsh punishments for women, no more sympathy, no more sympathetic approach, right? To really, really crack down and complete what they had kind of set out to do. That is out of step with the majority of Americans, including with many Christians and including with many conservative Christians. When push comes to shove, they want a more sympathetic and more kind of a complicated understanding of the issue, even if they identify as pro-life.
It's very interesting to see how this is playing out, and it's going to be a big issue in 2024, obviously. So look, on the right, I'd love you to touch on something that I talk about a lot. It's not like those people who are devout, they're truly devout. They believe that this is a Christian nation, a white conservative Christian nation, and they have a loss like this. They don't view this as defeat, do they? They view this only as a setback, and then they try to come up with other tactics to achieve their goals. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'm watching, I'm listening, watching the results come in last night and watching different spaces. And I've seen a little bit of soul searching in terms of, particularly around the issue of abortion. Wait a minute here. What we have failed to change hearts and minds, right? And again, if you're living in a democracy, end of the day, you're going to have to you're going to have to convince, you're going to have to change people's minds. So I have seen some of that, which I actually think is a really healthy response, right? That's a pro-democracy kind of response, whether you agree with their position or not. That's the approach that you would like to see people take in a functioning democracy. I have also seen the other side, and I think a bit more of that, which is, if we don't have numbers, we're going to have to pursue other avenues here. We're going to have to lean in harder. See, we can't trust the population to make the moral choice. They don't need more compelling testimonies. They need to have the power taken from them. And so I'm really seeing both in those spaces.
So that would go more to that latter one, is more the idea that if they're truly this kind of fanatical Christian nationalist, that democracy has to give in to their moral beliefs, and their moral beliefs have to be the law imposed on everyone by law.
Yes, that is the logic of the more extreme edges. Now, the really difficult conundrum here is that the ordinary average American evangelical in the mega church down the street, right? Where are they going to fall here? And that's what's so tricky, because the rhetoric that they have heard often their entire lives, when they turn on Christian radio, the stuff they're hearing when they get a book from a Christian bookstore, like this is reinforced over and over again that yes, America is God's special nation. And of course, our laws should reflect God's laws. And of course, don't we want what is good and what is true, right, for our nation? That is very compelling. And then you've got more extreme individuals who are working politically to undermine our democracy, or who are more than happy to do so if that's what it takes. And the real question, I think, for 2024 and for our foreseeable future is these, well-intentioned, kind-hearted, many of them, right, conservative Christians who fill the pews of American churches, who have been steeped in these teachings, where are they going to draw the line, right? Are they going to say, yes, these are my values, but at the end of the day, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose? Or are they going to be pulled along by those who say the stakes are so high, this is God's word against a secular, evil, demonic force, and we need you with us? And that to me is an open question.
Yeah, and that's true. And it's not exact by any sense of the analogy, but in terms of, say, the Taliban, it wasn't about give up their values or their views. They may have evolved over 20 years, but now they're back in power and they're going back to their old ways. And, in that part of the world, tribal warlords are more commonplace than in America, thankfully. So we go to democracy first. I wonder if if it will be enough to make them, the ones in America, happy, if they can just have in their red states, these kind of like Bible, sort of like these Bible theme parks come to life. And go like, okay, everybody move here, because in Utah or North Dakota, not any state particular, we can do it here. So we can't change the rest of the country, but everybody move here, sort of having like their own colony or commune. What do you think about that?
For true Christian nationalists, that's only a step on the way, right? Because the idea that this is God's nation, that means that when we do succeed in aligning our laws with God's laws, then we will secure God's blessing. And as a nation, if we do not do that, then things are going to get ugly here. Right, things are going to get dark, and so that there's a kind of logic here to that. Now, again, not all Christians are going to fall in that bucket by any stretch. And in fact, as I'm facing this conundrum here and calling out the dangers for democracy, I'm also aware, in terms of my broader historical scholarship and around the rise of authoritarianism globally, that what's really important in moments like these, historically speaking, is to strengthen the center right, to strengthen those moderate Christians who hold those conservative values, but can hold them in such a way that is still acceptable for a flourishing civil society, for a flourishing democracy. And I will say that inside some of these conservative spaces, the people who are trying to do just that are getting hit really hard from the right and often from the left as well. And so, as I'm thinking about what can we do, I always have my eye on that center right.
You're probably familiar with Russell Moore so I had him on my show about a month or so. He had written some article very anti-Trump. And so we found common ground on that, because I really am of the mindset from books like How Democracies Die, written by the two Harvard professors, where examples where they survive is that you actually bring alliances of people you disagree with fundamentally on issues, but you stand up for democracy, which was great. But then somehow we stumbled into abortion, and it was like, okay, we're just going to stop now, and we're not going to continue this part of the conversation. I actually cut it out, because this is not what you're on. I didn't want to debate him on when life begins at conception. Somehow it stumbled out, and bingo, I'm like, oh boy. Look, we're here to find a common ground on this one issue, because I'm a person of faith. I'm a Muslim, but I'm a person of faith, and I respect people of faith. But until they want to turn their faith into law, then it's no longer respect. And I'm going to use all my powers, my abilities to try to defeat that. But, so he can believe what he wants. When he wants to make it laws, when I'm like, that's when we cross the line here. So let's talk about someone who I think wants to make his views law, because that's the way he's acted. It's the new speaker, Mike Johnson from Louisiana, who really, we're learning more about him. Republicans were remarkable. They found a guy no one knew. You Googled him, and Mike Johnson's such a common name. You didn't even know it was him. And
brilliant.
That is this guy. Wow. So he has really an extreme track record of anti-LGBT views, really demonization, even criminalization of people in the gay community that he has advocated for. No civil rights, still to this day calling people being gay a lifestyle choice. Like literally said that on Fox News a couple of weeks ago. Like, where are you from? He sounds like I feel like I'm talking to a segregationist who's from the 1950s, but on issues of LGBTQ, but it's 2023 and he's a relatively young guy for politics. Yeah. So what can you share? What red flags are you seeing with him?
So this is funny the way you set this up, because I was just texting with a kind of friend contact in conservative evangelical spaces. She's still there, grew up in these spaces, and we're talking about Johnson and what I said, and she absolutely agreed with, is this is a weird moment for those of us who know these spaces well, because on the outside, people are discovering these things about him, and it's the weirdest thing in the world, right? His accountability, using his 17-year-old son as an accountability partner for porn use, Covenant Eyes, right? All of us who know this world, like, oh, that's the Covenant Eyes software, right? It's so common. Like, that's not even weird to us when it's so weird to the outside. Covenant marriage, same thing, right? Like these sorts of things, right? Okay, it's unusual to carry it to that kind of legal level, but the principles involved are extremely common. So it's kind of strange for us that, yes, we can see him and his views, and particularly around LGBTQ, but really around a number of issues as fairly extreme in terms of the broader spectrum of American voters. In conservative evangelical spaces, he is not weird, right? He is very standard. And what shocked me when I Googled him too, right? Because Mike Johnson, who is this guy, every single thing I learned about him just placed him so incredibly securely in the conservative evangelical world, right? So he's goes to an SBC church. He's been a church that was affiliated with the Conservative Baptist Network, which is the right-wing flank of the SBC. He worked at ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, right, where Moore used to work, but he was before Moore's time, I believe. Family Research Council, and then ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, hugely important. And then he was on sharing the stage with Robert Jeffress, right, Trump's big supporter. And he was, I could go on and on and on. He is so securely embedded in this conservative evangelical world that I can't imagine there's another member of Congress who could outdo him on that front. And yet he was just, I think part of the reason he was unknown largely is because he was so very normal. There are so many Mike Johnsons out there in conservative evangelical spaces.
And I was going to ask you, that's a great point, that to us, to people who are not part of that world, and I'm not part of that world at all. I really don't even know the beliefs until I read your book and other books. I'm like, wow. And I'm like, okay, that's your beliefs. So be it. But so Mike Johnson, to me, who was a person of faith, but I'm pretty secular, and I want my public policy based on data and science and what's good for America, not what's in my religious text or anyone's text. We view him as very extreme. You're telling me he's not out of the mainstream of the conservative Christian movement?
No, he's not. Not at all, really. And he talks about the influence of David Barton. And David Barton is this kind of pseudo historian in evangelical spaces. I've known about him for 25 years or so. He's a really big deal in evangelical spaces, and nobody outside of evangelicalism has ever heard of him. But he advanced this idea of the myth of separation, that Thomas Jefferson and the founders didn't want to create the separation of church and state. They just wanted to protect the church from the intrusion of the state, but they absolutely wanted the church to shape the state. And that is, Johnson has said that this has been profoundly influential on him. He was teaching seminars on this concept in conjunction with a Family Research Council, I believe, or another focus on the family arm. This is who he is. And that really helped me understand where he's coming from, and all of his policy positions make sense in that light. And again, that is one of the concerns that I have when we talk about his commitment to democracy. How does he even understand this country? And we have to understand it in that kind of context. But those teachings, David Barton's teachings, this myth of separation, absolutely pervasive in conservative Christian spaces. It just infuses the popular culture, Christian school textbooks, homeschool curriculum, Christian radio. You're going to come across this everywhere.
And as we wrap up here, when you mentioned that, Lauren Boebert's comment, I looked it up quickly, came to mind from last year, where I'm sick and tired of this church and state separation. The government's 100%. Not supposed to direct the church. That's not what the founding fathers went. But so she was saying to the rest was like, you're just making up stuff, but you're saying it's actually part of the religious dogma that some on the right subscribe to. That's a mainstream view on the right. And to us, like, what are you talking about? Wow. Exactly. So common. And so when I hear, when I hear somebody like Rick Santorum, when he says that, when I hear somebody like Mike Johnson, basically anything that he says fits in this framework. And he says that himself. He talked about his career as a legal ministry, that his entire professional life is shaped around these values. And he is very open and honest about that. So I was going to ask you about 2024, but we'll save it. Hopefully in a few months and early in the new year, you can come back on. We'll see if Donald Trump is the nominee or if he's inmate 12745 at that point. But whoever is the nominee on the right, they're going to have to deal with these issues. If people want to sign up for your Substack newsletter, which I really recommend, what's the best place they can go to?
So I'm on Twitter, I guess now X, and you can find a link there, but just go to Substack, search Kisten Du Mez. It's Kisten Du Mez Connections. Well, thank you very much. It's always great chatting with you. Scary, but informative. And I really appreciate it. I look forward to chatting with you in the new year.